You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi. I want to thank you for joining me again. I also remind you to go to HebrewInIsrael.net to visit the website. This week's Haftarah is a very, very unique one because it is a reading of an entire book. But we're not reading a very, very long book. But the book itself is very unique in the sense that it is a prophecy for one group of people, and it's not Israel. The prophecy itself, by proxy, is about Israel, but is not directly to Israel. So we're in the Haftarah Vayishlach, and we're reading from the vision of Obadiah, Chazon Obadiah, and it is a very poetic prophecy. It's structured like poetry, it has a rhythm, and it talks about just about Edom. No one else. Just about Edom. To understand this prophecy, we need to understand, and I've explained this before, but I'll remind you again, because not everyone listens to all the episodes that I've done, or you might stumble upon this episode and never heard of me before. So I have to give some background about what this prophecy is about. First of all, who is Ovadiah? Well, we actually don't know. It only says his name is Ovadiah. Now, Ovadiah means servant of Yah, from the root avad, and Yah being the theophoric suffix. It's not Ovadiahu, by the way, it's only Ovadiah. And the interesting theory about Ovadiah, this is an idea which appears in rabbinic sources, is that he was actually an Edomite who converted to being a Judean or an Israelite. Now, the reason I say Judean is because and this is the background, because the prophecy itself talks about the atrocities of Edom, and the only atrocities that we know of Edom towards Israel is only towards Judea. During the Neo-Assyrian Empire, Tiglath-Pileser III being really the father of all of it, even though there were a few before him, he started attacking the area of Great Assyria, the Levant, and he subdued many, many different groups, and one of them was the Judeans, the Philistines, and also the Edomites. The Edomites had a lot of anger towards the Judeans because the Judeans did enslave the Edomites at least for a while. They can have a debate if it was under also the authority of the northern kingdom, the Israelians we'll call them, but the main thing is that Edom, eventually, when Judea lost a lot of its strength in times of King Hezekiah, and maybe even before that, we already hear about Edomites invading southern Judea into the Judean plain around the second half of the 8th century BCE, so the 700s, from around 739, I would say, more or less. Again, the numbers are never exact, because we can't really pinpoint the exact numbers. But the Edomites become a fierce enemy of Israel because they had the backing of the Assyrians, and they took over a lot of territory. The problem is that from the prophecies themselves, we can't really pinpoint when exactly this happens. Now, the timeline, the possibility starts from around the second half of the 8th century, all the way to the destruction of the First Temple at around 586. That's the usual number you hear, but it's always debatable. A lot of issues of chronology are connected to how we reconstruct the Egyptian history and how we reconstruct the astronomical calendar of the Assyrians, and we kind of corroborate all this information. There's all this information. I apologize for mispronouncing that word. And the problem we have with Egypt is that most of our reconstruction is based on the 3rd century BCE priest Menethon, and he presents before us up to his point about 30 dynasties. But there's a lot of issues of, could it be that these were co-regencies where there were two dynasties at the same time? And is it possible that maybe he was counting years of kings who also lived at the same time? The correlation of the information with the rise of the dog star, or the I think it's pronounced Sirius or something like that. I think they called it, at least the latter Egyptians called it that name, more or less. And the problem that we have is that a lot of our chronology of the ancient world is strongly based, especially the chronology of the land of Israel, is strongly based on Egyptian chronology, which means that the exact dating of anything is always in question. And this is why when we deal with dates, it's always an approximation, so the numbers never take them as exact numbers. By the way, this actually connects to also another interesting thing that happens with how long did the first temple stand, how long did the second temple stand. There's a lot of different theories about all of this, and this is why chronology is always a nightmare. I remember when I was studying some archaeology, we were assigned an attempt to try to date something, and it was very, very difficult because we had to take an inscription from one place, an inscription from another place, and they kind of see the timeline between them, and then try to figure out a specific site for how long that site existed and what are the possible years and so on. It gets a little messy. And what I was doing was on small scale. We're talking about if you try to reconstruct a chronology of something on a large scale, like for example, how do you correlate the years of the new Egyptian kingdom, which is really more important for us when it comes to biblical history and the history of the land of Israel. It gets very, very, very messy. I would recommend, for example, Immanuel Velikovsky. I think he wrote a book called Ages in Darkness or something like that. Immanuel Velikovsky, you can look him up on the internet. He wrote some really interesting books on the subject. He wasn't officially an Egyptologist or historian or anything, but he was very well versed with this material. One of the first people, at least that I read, that dealt with this question of chronology and really presented some really interesting points of view. Well, going back to our discussion here now, the prophecy itself is mostly about doom for Edom. Strongly reminds us of the prophecies at the end of the book of Isaiah. No, not the end of the book of Isaiah, but in the middle of Isaiah, we have, especially at the end of the book of Jeremiah, we have in the book of Ezekiel. So Obadiah is following the traditions of, or the practices, or whatever, the format that you would find with other prophets, you will find in the larger prophets, which, by the way, raises, at least with me, the question of, is this the entire book or not? Because for a prophet to only speak about this one group and only speak about them is very, very unusual. However, we do have a precedent to this with the book of Jonah, where the majority of the book, almost 99% of the book, is actually about Nineveh in Assyria. So it's not something very, very strange, but it's still very interesting that there's one chapter, it focuses on one subject. Now, we do need to understand that prophets sometimes prophesied once, and that was the only prophecy that they would give. Our understanding of how many prophets really existed and what they said and so on is only partially recorded. We have, for example, bits of prophecies in other places, like, for example, the book of Jeremiah, they quote a prophet called Zechariah, who was murdered, and they remembered his prophecy. So it's not unusual for us to only have bits and pieces of prophecy. So how far did Ovadiah's prophecy extend? We have no way of knowing. It could be that he continued prophesying in other contexts, and only this one was recorded in writing. And that's really a very important thing to understand about prophecy, that really what was recorded was recorded for us, things that can give us insight to the future. However, this doesn't mean that this is the entire scope of what was prophecy was like. So there's a lot of information that we just don't have. It's completely lost, at least lost to our history. But still, the prophecy of Obadiah is a very, very intriguing one, because he does talk directly to a group, which means that he had to speak to someone when he said these things. And the question is, did he do like Yonah, where he actually went to Nineveh and spoke to the people of Nineveh, as the book tells us, or did he speak to the people, encouraging them, saying, you see these Edomites who have attacked you, I'm going to speak God's word to them, but not necessarily to their ears, because if an Israelite would appear, you can argue if a Judean or an Israelite would appear in front of the Edomites, they'd probably try to kill him. He might have sent letters to the Edomites telling them, you're going to be destroyed. But there's a very high chance here that he actually spoke this to the Judeans and said to them, this is what God says about them. This is God's decree in the world. This is what he spoke. And when he spoke this is his judgment to them. And by speaking it here, after hearing it, speaking it here on earth, it becomes God's judgment unto his enemies. And therefore, this might have been something that was spoken to the Judeans, and the Edomites have never heard of it. Needless to say, the Edomites don't exist anymore. They did, for a very, very long time, dwell in southern Judea and the plains of Judea, but eventually they just vanished. Actually, to tell the truth, the Edomites eventually were in debt to the Judeans, because the Judeans, especially the Hasmoneans, released them from the control of the Seleucian tyranny. And the whole story, by the way, just to point this out, the whole story about Edomites converting and so on, there's plenty of research that proves that this never actually happened. People have misread Josephus. Josephus says that they circumcised, but actually if you research into, for example, I think Bickerman wrote about this, that the Edomites had anyhow circumcised. Now, I personally wrote a paper that included a discussion about, it's a paper in Hebrew, it's actually on my profile in academia, where I discuss Semitic practices in context of Ethiopia, but this discussion about Ethiopia led me to a question about the Edomites as well. And because I was talking about why do the Ethiopians circumcise, why is this Torah keeping amongst the Ethiopians, the Ethiopian Christians? And one of the things that came up was that some practices that they have were really historically something that was across the board with a lot of Semitic groups. And surprisingly enough, the eastern shore of Africa and the Horn of Africa, there are a lot of Semitic influences there. And really, we can't really talk about the Semitic world without including Nubia and south of the Egyptian kingdom. And it led me to the discovery that the Edomites actually did circumcise prior to this event, and therefore these ridiculous theories about that some Jews are not really Jews because of the Edomites. It's nonsense. There's no evidence of that. They never mingled with the Jews. The only person that we really know historically that converted, kind of converted, was Herod the Great. Even though he never really converted, Josephus does describe him as being like he grew a beard and refrained from eating horse. He never really kept much of anything else, and the thing was that he pretended to be a fearer of God, mostly because he was in a position where he was supposed to lead a group of people that hated him. So he was trying to find a point of similarity with him, but there's really no evidence whatsoever that Edomites actually converted. That's an historical fallacy. Regardless of people's ridiculous theological arguments and whatever spiritual things they try to argue, as an historical event, that never happened. Same thing, by the way, with the Khuzarites. Ashkenazi Jews, we know the history of Ashkenazi Jews. We know where they came from. It's well documented. I've read the documents myself. There's enough evidence that none of this is real. There's no evidence of mass conversion. To tell even more so, to convert to Judaism was at one point, you could be executed for such an act. And there were stories of people who were executed around that later on, but there are enough stories of Christian clergymen persecuting anyone who was interested in converting to Judaism. There's no evidence of mass conversion. Actually, more so, there's evidence from what I've read from the Dr. Rivka Shepek, is that there's actually evidence of conversion to Islam and not to Judaism, and that would explain the presence of certain Muslim groups near Russia, in the Russian area, and south of that. But in any case, Obadiah himself talks only in poetry here, because this is a prophecy. A lot of the prophecies in the Tanakh are in poetry. They have their rhythm. and so on. And we should just jump into this. It's actually a very, very straightforward prophecy. So the focus here is going to be more about the Hebrew, as I always do. If there are any special insights, I'll bring them up as well. So it says Chazon Ovadiah. So the vision, Chazon from root Chazah, to see the vision of Ovadiah. Ko amar Adonai Elohim le'Edom. Thus says the Lord Elohim to Edom. Now, everyone's going to read this and go like, what do you mean Adonai Elohim? It says Adonai Yud Hei Vav Hei. So the tradition is to read these cases of Adonai next to Yud Hei Vav Hei as Elohim, mostly to prevent the redundancy of Adonai, Adonai, even though historically it was read as Adonai Yud Hei Vav Hei, to emphasize God is the Lord. There's even a possibility, this is again a theory that I've been throwing around for several years now, that maybe the original was Adoni Yud Hei Vav Hei, my Lord Yud Hei Vav Hei. But the tradition is not, obviously, not to speak the name of God. This tradition, by the way, I'm going to take a moment here because I was actually always hoping to talk about this a little bit. The practice of not saying the name of God is much, much older than most people perceive. I mentioned this years ago in a different podcast, a different setting, but I'll bring this up here again because we have an incidence of this, that the practice of not speaking the name of God, it actually dates back to around the 5th century BCE. I think she might have actually received the title of professor, Sarah Yefet, who was jokingly called the chronologies lady, the expert of the period of the return to Zion, Persian era. She points out in a book that she wrote about this era, it does exist in English, it's a really, really expensive book, that we find evidence of avoiding the name of God in what we call the Elohim Psalms. That someone rewrote Psalms that were probably much earlier, rewrote them to be, instead of including the name of God, actually have the word Elohim, and she points this out as being a sign that people were avoiding using God's name at a much, much earlier stage. The problem is that we don't know how widespread it was, but it did exist. Hanan Eshel, for example, again, Hanan Eshel, an archaeologist, dealt a lot with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I actually had the pleasure of meeting him, arguing with him as well over something, Talmudic studies. And he points this out as well, that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is what he claimed. I think it might be the opposite, but in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see everything written in square letters in what's known as the Aramaic script. And every time you come to the name of God, it's written in Paleo-Hebrew. I actually think that the reason they're in Paleo-Hebrew is to represent the original appearance of the name. However, there are plenty of scholars, including Hanan Eshel, and I think maybe also Magen Broshi, I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly. But they argue that they put the name there in Paleo-Hebrew to mark that you're not supposed to read the name. However, more so, and this is a much more important example, prior to rabbis, around the time of the Pharisees, but before any rabbis really existed, there are Dead Sea Scrolls where instead of the name you see 4 dots to make sure that people know not to read the name there. So this practice is much, much older than rabbinic sources. It's a much, much older practice. I think it was quite common, and it's not unusual, especially if you read the research done by Epstein, where there's this discussions. There are many scholars who deal with rabbinic sources have these discussions about, did the rabbis really invent everything, or did they try to find an excuse, find through scripture or through whatever, an excuse to an existing practice, even though that practice is completely ridiculous, or a practice that has a logic to it, but there's no real evidence such a thing should exist. There are practices which I personally think are really ridiculous. It has nothing to do with me being against rabbinic Judaism or anything. Actually, I'm very, for those who know really who I am, know that I'm very, very pro-rabbinic Judaism, even though I do have my criticism as a person who grew up as an Orthodox Jew. But as a scholar, I have to say, when you compare this to the biblical text, there's some issues. But in any case, sidetracking again, but let's carry on. So it says, the Lord God to Edom, Shemua shamanu me'et Adonai utzir bagoim shulach. So we have heard a rumor from the Lord. And he's the prophet. He's saying, I've heard this. Now, Shmu'ah can be translated as rumor, but also can be translated as a saying or I would say something that was made heard. And he says, V'tzir bagoim shulach, and a messenger. Tzir is one of the terms used for messenger. There's a lot of research on royal messengers and so on. So a messenger is sent amongst the nations. Now, bagoim here doesn't necessarily mean that he spread out amongst the nations. It just means mankind. So a messenger, a word from God came, and a messenger was sent amongst mankind, saying, Kumu v'nakuma alea leminchama, let us rise and rise against her with war. Why is this? Because Edom attacked Judah. Edom attacked the beloved one of God. It says in verse 2, Hine katon netaticha bagoim, bazuyata me'od. Behold, I have placed you small, insignificant, amongst the nations. You are bazui. Bazui is you are extremely despised. Bazui is despised. Is someone who's spurned. Everyone hates him. Because they expand upon a border that doesn't belong to them. And therefore it's a disgraceful act to do such a thing. It says in verse 3, Zadon li becha eshiacha. The wickedness. Zadon is a wicked act. Some people say that, some translate it as your pride, but that's not a very good translation. The wickedness of your heart has led you, has convinced you to do, deceived you to do something. Shochne bechagave sela marom shivto. Those who dwell in the clefts of the rocks. Okay? He dwells in a high place, somewhere very lofty and high. Omer belibo miyurideni ar. It says in his heart, this is the wickedness. I'm so powerful. I'm so strong. Who will bring me down to the earth? Who has the ability to attack me in such a way? So God says, Im tagbia kanesher, even if you go up high like an eagle. So not an eagle. Actually, that should be translated as it's not what you would usually see as an eagle, say for example in the Western world, but it is a type of eagle. V'im ben kochavim sim kinech, and if between the stars you put your nest, misham oridcha neum Adonai, from there will take you down the word of the Lord. He's basically telling them you have no way to run away. You think that you're high up. Now the high up here can also be something physical, that maybe some parts of the land of Edom, for example, if you read some of the descriptions of the area of the eastern side of the river where it's Transjordan today, there are a lot of clefts there, and it's quite possible that the Edomites did dwell. Their kingdom mostly dwelled on an area that was very, very difficult to attack because it sat on a mountain range. So they're saying even if we retreat back into our mountain range and hide there, God is still going to get them. It says in Ganavim ba'o lecha. He's trying to point out to them how despicable and despised they are. If thieves will come to you, im shodedei laila, if the plunderers of night, ech nidmeta, how would you be perceived? What would you look like? He says, halo ignevu dayam, for usually they would still, they'll still how much they want in their sleeve and leave you with something. But he's actually saying, no, you're not going to have anything left. Okay. Now it's also possible nidmeta could also be from the word, not from the word dama, but from the word domin, which means to become like dung, like something which is destroyed. So there are two possibilities here. I would say the destroyed part is probably much better. So then they'll still as much as they need. Im botzirim ba'u lecha, if people who have come to gather grapes, betzira is the gathering of grapes, if they come to you, halo yashiru olelot, but they would leave something, would leave the small grapes. That's what an olel is. Also the word olel can also mean a baby. It says, Ech nechpesu Esav, niv'u matzpunav. How did they search? No, it's a rhetorical question. Look how much they searched Esav. They pierced through, they kind of broke through into everything which is hidden, everything that is, or is treasures. Matzpun, with safan, something that you hide. Adagvul shelechucha kol anshe veritecha. All the way to the border they have sent you, all the people of your covenant. Now, the question is, what exactly is he referring to here? Is he saying that the people who were his people of covenant betrayed him, and therefore he had to flee all the way to his border out of his land? Or that they convinced them to go beyond their border, and that was really the pride that they had to themselves, that they thought that they'll be able to attack someone outside of the border. So they convinced you, they betrayed you, and they presented themselves as if they're your friends. And Sheshelomecha says, Lachmecha yasimu mazor tachtecha en tevuna bo. Your bread, that which you consume. Now the bread here is really a metaphor to the idea of making covenant with someone. You sit and eat bread with them. So they actually placed it, this covenant, they placed it as a source of suffering, as a source of destruction for you. And it's a trap underneath you to capture you. And then he turns around. After speaking to them directly, now he turns to his audience and says, they, en tevuna bo. Edom has no knowledge, no wisdom in it. They have no understanding. Then he says in verse 8, now we're moving now to another, because it all works in one large flow, but there's like these little breaks in between. So verse 8 now stops the quotation and goes into something else. It says, Halo bayom hahu neum Adonai, for it will be on that day, says the Lord, Ve'vati chachamim me'edom utvona mehar Esav. I will make lost, because avad means to lose something, but it means to translate, if you ignore the basic root and point to the context, it means I will destroy all the wise ones from Edom and anyone with understanding, utvuna, any understanding from the mountain of Esav. Now, what's very interesting is that the last part of verse 7 feels like a continuation of verse 7, but it's really a bridge to push you ahead into verse 8, where he starts talking about the wisdom of Edom. Now, the reason he brings up the wisdom of Edom is because Edom is mentioned a few times, and especially, for example, in the book of Job, where one of Job's friends is actually Eliphaz Temani. And Eliphaz Temani means Eliphaz a southerner, and he might have actually been from Edom. And that there were some wise men who lived in Edom, and now he says all these wise men, all these people of knowledge are going to be completely lost. And he says, V'chatu giborecha teman, your fierce one, your warriors, your brave ones will be fearful. Teman, that's why I said Eliphaz Temani, because Edom was also referred to as Teman. Teman really means south. This is why, for example, modern day Yemen is known as Teman or Yaman, because it really means south in Hebrew. Now, I don't know why they call it Yaman or Yemen today, but Teman is Teman, Yaman. You lose the T at the beginning, the Tav. It's the same name, but in Hebrew it means south. But Edom back then was considered to be the south for everyone. So all your warriors, all your brave ones are fearful. Leman yikaret ish mehar Esav, for in order that all people will be cut off, will be destroyed from the mountain of Esav. And notice the fact that Esav is referred to as Har, which fits into what I said earlier in regards to Teman, regarding Edom or Teman being a mountainous region, which is very difficult to attack. Point out something, for example, Marin Fateh, who was an Egyptian pharaoh, there's a bit of a question, did he actually ever pierce into the mountains of Judea? Because it was just an uphill battle. And there's a whole question there. Did he really ever go out all the way up? Then one of the things about the Egyptians is they probably had barely ever really entered into the mountain region of Israel, and they only worked to attack the areas of the plain. The only ones to really start marching into the mountains were the Assyrians, who attacked Jerusalem, and then the Babylonians after them. But prior to that, everyone really tried to avoid the mountainous area. And it was because going uphill with soldiers makes everyone much more tired. It actually makes you a target, because you're always, if your enemy lives up top, you're always downhill from them, which makes you a much easier target. It says, "Lemani karet ish me'ar Esav mikatel." For in order that all the people from the mountain of Esav will be cut off from a massacre. The word katel, by the way, is a very interesting word because it appears in almost all Semitic languages. It means to kill. So mikatel, katel is basically a form of the act of a massacre here. It says, Mehamas achicha Yaakov. Now, if you misread this verse, you might think from the violence of your brother Jacob, but what it really means is from your violence against your brother Jacob. Now he gives him a clear explanation. After he puts all these threat downs, now we understand what's really going on. From your violence against your brother Jacob, shame will cover you, and he will be cut off forever. And Edom doesn't exist anymore. They might have some descendants, but the kingdom of Edom is no more. They are completely gone. All the Edomite cities are abandoned. There's no one who can trace himself back to Edom. Edom, this prophecy, you can actually say, has been completely fulfilled. However, if you go to rabbinic sources, Edom being the sworn enemy of Israel, Edom becomes Rome, and they'd say some of the Edomites traveled to Rome and everything, but historically speaking, none of this is historical, because the history of Rome is well known to us. But the metaphor itself is very well understood, because these were invaders who invaded a land that belonged to them. And the Edomites, those who did survive from the Edomites, around the second half of the Second Temple, were collaborators with the Romans, and this is why, for example, Herod the Great, who was an Edomite descendant, was associated with the Romans, and then by doing that, Rome became Edom. So now he says to them, he's now going to the details. When the day you stood idly by, when strangers captured Chelo, can be his armies, his people, or his treasures. So this can be, again, if it's it still fits either the times of King Hezekiah or the destruction of the first temple, because in both cases people were captured, taken away, and treasures were taken away as well. V'nochrim ba'u she'arav, and foreigners came to his gates. Now she'arav can be all the cities of Israel, because you have to remember that, for example, Sancheriv boasts that he destroyed 46 cities, and he besieged King Hezekiah inside Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. By the way, it doesn't really mean he really did that. There's a really interesting study that was done about this statement, and there's a lot of royal ideology in these writings. One of the ridiculous things that happens as a person who's trained both in history and biblical studies, and did a lot of work on inscriptions. Morton Kogan, or Mordechai Kogan, points out, if I remember correctly, he points out about this statement that stating that he captured King Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. This is a type of terminology used in other places as well, and other places were really ever really captured or anything really happened to them. So there's a lot of boasting as well, and what's the problem that we have is, and this is, for example, Dr. James Hoffmeyer says about this, is that why are we believing all these inscriptions and we never really believe the Bible? He also is a scholar, and he says we have to realize all these things were written with an ideology behind them. So what makes these inscriptions more important or more reliable? These writers also lied through their teeth in many, many cases. Look, for example, at the case of the Battle of Kadesh, where both the Hittites and the Egyptians claimed to win the battle, and in truth, it was probably a draw. So we have a very, very big problem in a lot of these historical descriptions. He says, foreigners came back to your gates. Val Yerushalayim yadu gorah, and on Jerusalem they cast a lot. Now yadu, the root yada, can be the idea of using your hand from the word yad, but really has to do with the idea of casting something. Lidot, yada, to cast a lot. Gamatak ahad mehem, also you were like one of them. You were sitting there eager to also take a piece of the action. So he says to them, Ve'al tireh b'yom achicha b'yom nocho, and do not see in the day of your brother the day that he became a stranger. Now, it's very important to point out that a lot of the statements in the book of Obadiah, some of them are very, very difficult to read. The exact meaning is sometimes unclear to us. And here, I have a question about the verb tireh. However, it's quite possible that the use here is to be seen in the sense of joy. So do not show yourself as joyous. On the day that he became a stranger to you, you are his brother. Val tismach, and that's how we know through the parallel here. And do not be joyful. Livnei Yehuda, to the children of Judah, the sons of Judah, or the people of Judea, because ben can also be used to indicate the idea of being affiliated with a specific group. So do not be joyful against. The lamed here is really an adversive situation. Do not be joyful against Judah, beyom ovdam, on the day that they are destroyed and lost. V'al tagdel picha beyom tzara. Do not increase your mouth, boasting on the day of strife. Al tavo b'shar ami beyom Edom. Do not come at the gate of my people on the day of, and again, some of the usage of the word here is, some of the uses of the words here are a little strange. But an aid can be used to indicate the joy of someone at someone's calamity. So when they say beyom Edom, he is sameach le'ed, he is joyful over the calamity. And therefore, same thing, by the way, we had earlier with your violence against your brother. The statements are structured where it's a little slightly reversed the way you're supposed to read it. It says, do not come in the gates of my people on the day of their calamity, where you are joyful over their calamity. Al tirega mata bera'ato beyom edo. Do not show yourself again through joy when he is in evil, when he is in a state of evil happening to him on the day of his calamity. Val tishlachna vechelo beyom edo. Do not send forth. Don't send forth your hand to take away on the day of his calamity. Okay, meaning don't loot on the day of the calamity. The Hebrew here is a little tough. It is a little tough. It's not unclear, but it is a slightly difficult Hebrew. And I'm deliberately reading. I actually knew that the Hebrew here is very difficult, and I under-prepped myself deliberately because I want to feel a little bit of confusion when I go through this. Now, I've read Ovadiah many times, and I know the commentary, but when I do a recording, I always prepare. And here, I'm actually doing something completely different. Because of the poetry style here and the difficulties of the language, I'm actually reading through this and thinking a lot. What is the Hebrew saying? What is the Hebrew really saying? And stopping for a moment and listen and reading a commentary, because I want you to understand that reading biblical poetry is not simple. It's not always that simple, and the way the sentences are structured are a little difficult. So I hope this way of seeing things makes things a little bit more clear about sometimes the difficulties of studying Hebrew. So it says, "V'al ta'amod al perek la'achrit peritav." Don't stand on the junction. It's interesting. He uses the word perek because a perek is usually a joint or something, but he's telling them don't stand at the junction to kill all the refugees of Judah. V'al tasger seridav beyom tzara. Do not give away to captivity the remains, the ones who survive on the day of calamity, the day of strife. He says, why so? Why shouldn't you do these things? He's giving them a warning, saying, be very, very careful. He says, Ki karov yom Adonai al kol hagoyim, for the day of the Lord is near on all the nations. Kasher asita ya'aselach gemulcha yashuv beroshecha. As if you have done shall be done to you, your reward will be placed upon your head. This is classic Italian law. As you have done shall be done to you. Edom stands in ruins today. The people of Israel are still alive. The Bible is still alive. The name of God is still spoken in the world. But who remembers the God of Edom? Who remembers any of the ancient enemies of Israel? No one. But then the modern day enemies of Israel, whomever they may be, if they are spiritual or physical, if they are against the land of Israel, against Israel and other places around the world, don't heed to these words. They don't listen, they don't remember, because those enemies don't exist anymore. And he says to them in verse 16, Ki kasher shetitem al har kodeshi, as you have plotted or drank. There's a question here. because shatat here can also mean to make themselves dwell, to put a foundation here. At least in my opinion. Obviously, many will go to the root shata to indicate the idea of drinking. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, this kind of reminds us a little bit of some midrashim that talk about the idea that the enemies entered the temple and had a feast there. And also have to remember that the Edomites had a god, if I'm not mistaken, that was something to do with wine as well. So drinking was part of probably the ceremonies of praising their god. But also, we also need to understand the double meaning of the word shatat here can mean to establish themselves on his mountain, to establish themselves on God's land by building their own cities. But the core meaning is actually to drink. It says, as you have drunk on my holy mountain, ishtul chol hagoyim tamid, all the nations will drink all the time. But then it's drinking you, consuming you. Veshatu vel'u v'hayu kelo hayu. And they will drink and they will swallow, it seems to be, and they will be as if they never existed. And there's a lot of questions of who exactly this is all directed to. So I want to say that they will always drink and they will consume Edom and they will swallow them, and the Edom will be as if they never existed. However, some do argue that that this is also in relation to any other enemies of Israel, that all the nations who are against Israel will eventually drink like Edom and then basically be consumed to such a point where they will be completely destroyed. He says, "Uvehar Tzion tiyeh feleta." On the mountain of Zion there will be a remnant. Vehaya kodesh, and it will be holy. Veyarshu bet Yaakov et Moshem, and the house of Jacob will inherit the ones who try to inherit them. Now this can be an indicator that we're talking about the times of King Hezekiah, because Jerusalem did survive. And then he says, "Vaya vet Yaakov esh," in the house of Jacob will be fire. Vet Yosef lehava, in the house of Joseph a flame. Mount Esav lekash, in the house of Esau to straw. V'dalku vahem va'achalum, and they will burn in them and they will consume them. V'lo yihiyeh sarid levet Esav ki Adonai diber, there will not be a remnant to the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. So this we're almost even done with the book. It's a very, very short book. It's very condensed. We're jumping from one point to the other very, very, very quickly. Everything is expressed very, very quickly. I mean, even I am having like shortness of breath reading through this, jumping from one point to the other. But the main message here, this is the thing, Edom is only an example. Edom is only an example to really what God is saying to everyone else. That anyone who is against Israel is really against God. And God is a warrior, and He will stand up and consume His enemies and destroy them. So Edom is only one example out of different nations during this period who joined the Assyrians. But the difference is as follows. It looks like as if Edom voluntarily joined. For example, when everyone else rebelled, and this is some historical background, every time everyone rebelled against the Assyrians, if it's the Battle of Karkar in 853, if it's the rebellion of the 730s, 734 to 731 BCE, every time someone rebelled against the Assyrians, Edom never joined. Edom was never in the picture. So why is Edom singled out? Because they probably voluntarily joined the Assyrians, joined the enemies of Judah. And this is why they're punishment. This is why they're singled out and punished, and this is why we have this entire book just about them. Yes, Esav is mentioned in other places as well. If I'm not mistaken, Esav is mentioned in the book of Jeremiah and in other places as well. But Ovadiah singles them out because what they did was ridiculous. They were Israel's brothers. They shared a culture. They were both circumcised. They were both descendants of Avraham. But the Edomites didn't care. This is why their act was so despicable. Moab, Ammon, true, cousins, distant cousins. Edom was brother. Edom was blood. And when blood attacks blood, it's despicable. And this is why he says, Bazuyata, you are despicable. So then he says, going now into, again, what's going to happen with territory. He says, verse 19, Veyarshu hanegev et har Esav. the Negev, the southerns of Judea, who inherit the mountain of Esav, Vashefelait Pelishtim, and the coastal plain and the lowlands of Judea, the Philistines, because these are the areas the Philistines were here, the Edomites were there. By the way, the fact mentioning the Philistines here does still fit very strongly with King Hezekiah, because at the same time, besides the Edomites, the Philistines were, if we're talking about the attack of Tiglath-Pileser III, we're talking about around the year 734. There was either one or two, depends who you ask, but it might have been one or two. There was one for sure, maybe two, campaigns against the Philistines. The Philistines were actually forced. They were vassal kings of Assyria, and they were given pieces of land by the Assyrians as punishment for Judea. So now taking back that land. So I feel this fits much better into that period. So the dwellers of the lowlands, the plains of Judea will inherit the Philistines. Ve'yelshu et tzedeh Ephraim ve'et tzedeh Shomron. So they will inherit, the Judeans will inherit the field of Ephraim and the field of Shomron. And that sounds more like after the destruction of the northern kingdom. So again, fits more that period of that around 734 times of King Achaz, even his father, King Uzziel, especially King Hezekiah, 701, the great rebellion against the Assyrians. This is when Judea really stood its ground, and Jerusalem specifically stood its ground against the Assyrians. So it sounds very fitting that they would inherit that, and it sounds a lot like the times of King Josiah. He, according to the descriptions, went up north, went all the way to Bet-El, so he's taking the land of Ephraim, the land of Shomron. Uvinyamin et Gilad, and the tribe of Benjamin will inherit the Gilad. Gilad used to belong to the northern kingdom. Gilad was part of a property feud between Judea, Israel, and even the Arameans. That's actually something I focused on when I wrote my paper about this period, about King Achaz. So Binyamin will take the Gilad, which means Judea will take that property that was in dispute at the time with Aram and Israel. So all this actually has very, very precise historical backgrounds. Vegalut hachela ze livnei Israel, and this exile which began to the children of Israel. Now he's referring to the northern kingdom and parts of Judea who were exiled. Asher Knaanim al Tzarfat, which were Asher Knaanim. Now there's a question what this term Knaanim really means. I wanted to argue that they were sold all the way to the place called Tzarfat, which is north of the land of Israel, goes kind of into Syria, if I'm not mistaken. It's because the term Knaan was also meant merchant. Now, you can also say that this is the areas they were exiled to, and will also be the lands that they will inherit because they were exiled there. Vegalut Yerushalayim asher bisfarad. Now, it's a very funny thing. Tzarfat, Sfarad. These are all areas in Spain is Spain, and even you can say southern France, a part of the Iberian half island, the Iberian island peninsula. Much better correctly say peninsula, but the Iberian Peninsula. But Tzarfat and Sfarad here are actually places more near in our area. Tzarfat, some people want to argue is somewhere in Europe. It's really not really clear. It's probably because some medieval commentators wanted to say areas they live in, some wanted to say it's areas in Germany, some went to, by the way, no one was living in Germany at this time. Germany was completely empty at this period. Maybe some tribes traveled through, but they never really dwelt there. So in truth, Tzarfat is Tzafarnad, which is 15 kilometers south of Sidon of today, Sidon. It's on the border of the land of Asher. It was considered to be a Canaanite city. Might be the Asher Knaanim at Tzarfat, the Canaanites who live in Tzarfat. I want to take the direction of they were also sold there because we do know people were taken captive. Sfarad is probably the Aramaic form of the word, the city of Saradis, which is is actually a kind of a Eastern Greek city, and it's in Asia Minor. So these are not the places all the way west, France and Spain, as modern language will indicate, but it's actually areas much, much closer. In truth, the people at this period who were exiled the furthest were actually people who were taken into Assyria, which is miles, I think it's 12 or 1,600 miles away from here, if I'm not mistaken, east of the land of Israel. It says, Yereshu et Arei HaNegev. So they will come back and they will inherit the lands of the south. So you can read this, as I said. Some people say they will inherit these areas there as well, but also will go all the way down south, so north to south. They will control from the north all the way down south, meaning the entire land of Israel, the entire promised land. That's one way of reading it. But you can also say that they will just return from these places of exile and go back to their land down south, because a lot of Judeans live down in the area of the Negev. And then he ends with a statement. He says, Va'alu Moshi'im behar Tzion, and redeemers will come up from the Mount Zion, lishpot et har Esav. Israel will return back to its glory, to its strength. The throne of judgment will exist again, and then redeemers will come from the mountain of Zion to judge the mountain of Esav. Notice the idea of Mount Zion versus the mountain of Esav, Judah versus Edom. Jerusalem sits on a mountain, capital of Edom sat on a mountain. It says, V'hayta la'Adonai melucha, but the end of all of it is that the Lord will have the throne. In truth, it's not about this king or that king, it's about God. God being king of all. And this statement is very, very powerful, because we have to understand that this is a period, and even to this very day, man always thinks that he rules the earth, but God says, no, I rule the earth, and your deeds are under my supervision. He says even Edom attacks, or Syria attacks, or whomever attacks, at the end of it, everyone would understand that God has his messengers in earth, and he will give these messengers the power to pass judgment against his enemies. Because in truth, the history of God is also the history of his people. And through his people we know who God is, because he acts for his people, by his people, to show the world that he is king. And the purpose of being Israel is to be chosen. As one of my teachers, Professor Yonatan Bendel, points out, he says, the Bible is a story of God wanting to be king and wanting to have a relationship with mankind through choosing people throughout history, until he lands on the people of Israel and says, okay, these are people I wanted to represent. So I hope you enjoyed this recording. I apologize if it was a little disjunctive, but it was partially purposeful, because I wanted you to kind of get a little bit of the difficulty of working through a biblical text, especially one that has a little bit of difficult language in it. If you want to really go through a ringer with this one, we can try to do something with the book of Job, and then we'll be dwelling 5-10 minutes on each verse just to try to understand exactly what's going on there. But I guess thank you for joining me again. Again, don't forget to visit HebrewInIsrael.net. And again, like always, please share with your friends. Spread it around, comment, but remember, my purpose here is to teach. If you disagree with something, this is not a spiritual war or any war of any sort. If I'm wrong about something, explain to me why I'm wrong. Show it to me. And I'll be perfectly fine to accept your explanation or explain why I disagree with you. But it's very important to have a discussion, not a war, not a fight. Having a difference of opinion doesn't mean that we have to argue about things. Let's not be like Yaakov and Esav. Let's remember that we are all brothers, wanting to understand what God wants from us. Even if we come from different places and we originate from different faiths, we're still trying to follow one God, one King, who will become King over all of us. Kol Tov.